Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Who do I thank? What organization? NED-X?
NED.
NED, all right.
And the sub, which is
Thank you, the sub. A beautiful space. It's like old-time Mission. Like not many places left like this. So how many people here have taken MDMA before? Raise your hand. Who hasn't? Oh, there's a handful. Okay, great. So Berra and I can kind of know what we're dealing with. So does everyone know it was pure when they took it? Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So what I want to talk about tonight is kind of different than my normal talk. Of course, I'm going to talk about my movie, but I want to talk about why MDMA is going to be the second drug legalized after marijuana. It will be. It has to be. I'm going to explain why I think that's the case and why we'd all need to get on board with that plan. And not just medical legalization, but the legal regulation for recreational use too. But first, what I want to do is show my first short film. It's 9 minutes, and it was kind of a tribute to MAPS and the work that they've done. Who has already seen my 9-minute short film, MDMA Therapy and Healing? Oh, great. I'm so glad that very few of you have actually seen it. And then, once that's 9 minutes long, a lot of people call it a trailer. It's not. It's just kind of my short film. And after that, I'm going to invite Berra to talk first because the film really highlights MDMA's medical use. I interviewed a number of veterans, rape survivor who went through the MAPS FDA-approved studies, and their testimony is very powerful. And then Berra and Amy here, God, I just learned this too, the unsung heroes of MAPS. Everyone know who MAPS is? Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and Rick, a close friend and colleague, gets all the credit, but really these two women here are like, I just learned, are like the backbone driving the work. So
there's one more here too.
Oh, who's that?
Rebecca. Oh,
all right. Of course it's women. So let's see, I might need some technical help to get this thing working. Thank you. So MDMA and love. All right, hold on, where's my pointer? That's very profound, right? You know, even a drug that produces empathy is profound, but a drug that produces feelings of love, right? I mean, wow, what is love? There are so many definitions for it. But I just want to say one thing about PTSD that I learned doing these interviews, and I think it relates. Then I'll turn it over to Berra. And that is, before I started making this film, I had a pretty rudimentary understanding of PTSD. I thought, okay, you have these traumatic experiences, you're in war, people trying to kill you, and you have this heightened, hypervigilant stress response that just doesn't go away. And you come back, you still think people are trying to kill you, or you're fearful, or you were raped, and you think people may still rape you, and hypervigilance. And that is part of it. But what I learned in every single person that I interviewed is that PTSD is very largely intertwined with your sense of self, your sense of identity, particularly around guilt and shame. That seems to be really crucial in why you kind of get stuck and not be able to put things in the past and get over it. Like whether it's not doing enough to save your fellow soldiers, like Tony Macy, or Nigel McCorry, who accidentally killed 2 young girls in front of their father and was tormented by that. He says, I thought I was a monster. Even Rachel Hope, the rape survivor, who was raped as a child. How can you blame yourself for that, right? But, that's what happens, I've learned. And she said she thought there must be something wrong with her for these horrible things to have happened to her, like the universe was telling her she's bad. And in all these cases, one way MDMA helped, and I think really one of the primary way MDMA helped these people overcome their PTSD was to, for maybe the first time since their trauma, give them self-forgiveness, to understand who they really are, so that empathy that when you don't suffer trauma that you experience at a rave or with friends partying, where you connect with others, for people who did, and that was me too. When I first did MDMA, it was therapeutically because of childhood abuse. I, felt that, like, I'm okay. So it's profound. It's very, very profound, and I'm humbled to make this movie. I am in debt to MAPS, who I wouldn't be able to do this without them, who's paved the way 30 years now. Rick hand-delivered the lawsuit to the DEA when the DEA banned it, and then they actually won. The judge ruled it should be Schedule 3, but then the DEA just ignored the judge's ruling. And they've been doing the good fight since then, working it through the FDA. So Berra, I can't pronounce your last name.
It's all right, nobody can.
Berra, your title with MAPS again is?
Clinical research
Scientist.
Yeah.
Hey.
I'm just going to switch this guy.
Okay.
Just do this. Do you want to get that? All right. So thanks, everyone, for coming to hear us and to see Emanuel's movie. I just want to point out I'm not the only MAPS person here. We have our clinical team here, Amy Emerson, Rebecca Matthews, Allison Willens, and you can talk to them after the event if you have any questions. Also, so we're kind of here to help everybody understand better what is going on with MAPS. And actually, I have some very exciting data to share with you today, because I think that the movie is amazing. It really kind of helps you to understand what each individual is going through, and unfortunately, individuals are sometimes open to bias, and so if something really affects you as a person, that might mean in your mind, oh, it was definitely MDMA, and this is going to be my savior. It's going to give me my sense of self back from something that was missing. And so that's the reason why we need to do this research in more and more people, so that we can say in this large group of people the same effect was seen. And that's really where we can gain our power and demonstrate to regulators and scientists worldwide that this is real. It's not just one or two individuals having an opening, like heart-opening, mind-changing experience. It's not just because of who they were before and who they are after MDMA. And so for that reason, we're doing this research with MAPS. So MAPS has been around for 30 years. We're actually just about to celebrate our 30th anniversary next month, which is going to be happening in Oakland at the Scottish Rite. And we're all going to be there, so you can come and see us there again. And so MDMA has been illegal since 1985, and interestingly, the MDMA that we use in our clinical trials was also manufactured in 1985. It's the same batch. So remarkable stability. Let's see, so for navigating, I'm just gonna come over here. All right, so let's get started. Like I said, I'm the clinical research scientist for MAPS. And when MDMA and FDA first kind of met each other, this was back in 1992. There were a lot of concerns about MDMA being used in recreational contexts. It was being marketed as ecstasy, and there were lots of concerns. But a lot of these were based on animal studies and also observations of people who were at raves and nightclubs. Neurotoxicity was one, where in animals there were concerning findings about serotonergic neurons and how they were affected poorly by MDMA. There was concerns about hyperthermia, which is when your body temperature goes up above 38 degrees Celsius, so 37 is about normal in Celsius. And so lots of these people were overheating at raves and nightclubs. There were concerns about hyponatremia, where it's low blood sodium. So people knew that they felt dehydrated from experiencing MDMA in these settings, and they were drinking lots of water, which then diluted their blood too much, and then caused low blood sodium and complications from that. There were concerns about cardiovascular complications, so high blood pressure, high heart rate, and also concerns about serotonin syndrome, which is actually, interestingly, also part of the risks of antidepressants that many people currently take. And it's just not seen that often, but it is one of the risks of what happens when you increase the levels of serotonin in your brain. So acute renal failure was another one where these were all kind of seen typically together in individuals that had issues with ecstasy. And then also there were concerns about kind of like the suicide Tuesdays or suicidal thoughts. Now, in clinical settings, it's becoming clear that these really don't have any bearing on our findings in clinical settings. And so the big question is, do these apply to MDMA? So MDMA's clinical development program officially began in 2001 with a file, an investigational new drug file, opened with the FDA for the treatment of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And we're hoping that this is going to be a 20-year clinical development program, hence the 2021. So because of all of the regulations that apply to MDMA, we have to, just like any investigational drug, we have to have FDA's green light to be able to study this drug in clinical trials in humans. We also have to have approval from an IRB, or an institutional or independent review board. So these review boards make sure that the research is done ethically, with the safety of the human participants in mind, and also that nothing is going to jeopardize their safety. And also we have to have approval from the DEA. And so the DEA has to license each and every one of the clinical sites that are studying MDMA in clinical trials, which is, it further adds to the hurdles, and gradually, over the years we've gotten better with making sure that they're, evaluating the applications appropriately. And now we're in a pretty good place with DEA and MDMA. So in addition, in California and several other states, there's additional state-level review boards that have to approve your research, and also may have opinions about how your research is conducted, which is kind of a problem because they may not know what they're talking about. So we also have to have their approval. So as you might get a sense, MAPS has developed a ton of expertise in negotiating with government agencies, both at the federal and state level, as well as negotiating with ethics committees. And so it's a constant process of education, and that's why we're a research and education organization partly. So the main goal is to be able to study the risks and benefits of MDMA. And so we have published several studies. There's more coming this year that are going to be published, and the studies are done, and we're working on the data. We're also just got approval for doing a demonstration study in collaboration with some Veterans Affairs researchers. And so we're not able to do this research directly through the Veterans Administration because they have their own funding mechanisms so you not only do you have to ask for their approval, you also have to ask for their money, which is not always a winning proposition. We also have another VA researcher at Emory University who is really prominent in the PTSD fields, and she's very interested in collaborating with us, and we're hopeful that that's going to go forward soon. In addition to PTSD, we've also done one study for treating social anxiety in adults on the autism spectrum. And we also have a study that's ongoing in Marin, not very far from here, for treating anxiety related to having a life-threatening illness like cancer or a non-dementing neurological illness. And MAPS does its research in an open source way with transparency. So the reason we do it that way is because we want all the scrutiny we can get. We want to make sure that these studies are bulletproof. They have to be super rigorous in order to withstand FDA and to convince people, in the light of all of this negative, concerns about ecstasy, we have to be absolutely sure of what we're saying. And in addition, MAPS has an anti-patent drug development approach. All right, so this is our container. MDMA is only given together with psychotherapy. So psychotherapy and rooms like this one are the container, meaning that it's not a container that a typical kind of ecstasy-related scenario would be in. And this container we found is crucial for ensuring the safety of MDMA in a clinical setting. So we have, the ambient temperature is controlled, it's quiet, it's calm, it's private. It's kind of a living room setting so that you're not in a sterile hospital. And it's, you always have the attention of 2 therapists during psychotherapy sessions, and that helps to make sure that you're getting, whatever comes up, the therapists can manage it. Sometimes, people who have PTSD or have an aversion to people of a certain gender, so we try to balance that by having another therapist available to step in. Also, it's patient-led psychotherapy, so otherwise known as non-directive psychotherapy, meaning that the therapists are never telling the participants what to do. Everything is always an invitation. Would you be interested in trying this? So MDMA or a comparator or placebo is only given on 2 to 3 occasions, and it's a month apart. So we have an intermittent dosing regimen. This is not something that's taken every day. This is not something that's taken at home. And so with this new paradigm of medication, we're also in conversation with FDA on how to customize what's expected of MDMA in order to be approved. In addition, it's rapid onset. So in some of our studies, after a single treatment, people have a dramatic effect. Tony Macy, who you saw in the movie before, he had 1 MDMA session and he decided he never needed MDMA ever again, and he dropped out and he's still PTSD free. And then also each session is followed by 3 or more integration sessions. So this is psychotherapy delivered by trained and very skilled therapists. Now, what I'm showing you here are the acute adverse reactions to MDMA based on 100 subjects who got MDMA at 100 or 125 milligram, and we have a supplemental dose that's given 1.5 to 2.5 hours after the initial dose. So the sessions are quite long. It's like an 8-hour session, 6 to 8 hours, depending on the individual and how they metabolize the drug. Now, most prominent acute effects are circled here. So what you want to do is always compare the data that you're seeing to the inactive placebo people. So the placebo people also get the same psychotherapy. They're in the same setting. And so a lot of these are, kind of more on the higher percentages on the MDMA side, because we do think that these are actually associated adverse reactions to MDMA. Muscle tension also frequently comes up, some nausea, there's a lot of serotonin receptors in the gut, and feeling cold, so that's where the temperature control system of the body is influenced. And so these are kind of matching up with some of the concerns that people had about taking MDMA in recreational settings. Now, the thing that's not happening is we're not getting the same heightened, severe levels of those things. We're not getting hyperthermia. We're not getting hyponatremia. We're not getting problems with cognitive function, really. Now, 7 days after MDMA, during the week after, so there's about 4 days into that week, there's still residual levels of MDMA and metabolites in the body. However, what we're starting to see is that the symptoms of PTSD, which are anxiety, fatigue, insomnia, depressed mood, needing more sleep, the symptoms of PTSD are actually what people report mostly in these PTSD studies. You can tell because there's more percentages, the higher percentages are in the placebo group rather than the MDMA group. Then when you start getting down into kind of the decreased appetite, a little bit of dizziness, there is some stuff going on that's residual during those 7 days after. And we're going to be working with FDA and customizing, hopefully, our list of what we should expect during the 7 days after, based on these findings. Now, also body temperature. So there were concerns about hyperthermia. So the main thing I want to point out here is we have pre-drug measurements, during the drug, and after. And you can see that during the drug, yes, there is some increase, but it's not huge. Nobody went up to 38 degrees Celsius, which was the concerning range, right? There's these thin bars, or the standard deviation, which shows you like the variability within the groups that are represented. And so yes, there's like variation, and the data that we're showing is on average. So you can see that yes, the drug does cause a little bit of elevation. In some studies it's statistically significant, but it's not clinically important. It's not a medical concern that it goes up. And then it comes back down, which is the important part. Now this is our blood pressure data. We mentioned there were concerns about cardiovascular risk. Well, same trends apply for the blood pressure. It goes up a little bit, comes back down. And nobody has had any clinically important increases in blood pressure. Now this is the outcome data. This is like the big reveal. So we have data from 101 people in this graph. And the blue line is the 0 to 40 milligrams of MDMA. So what we've done is we're using either a placebo or a very low dose of MDMA to compare our higher dose, our moderate but higher dose of MDMA. And the reason that we're doing that is because we really need to have like an appropriate control for MDMA, and that's actually kind of hard to find because most people can tell if they got MDMA. So, so that's why we've been exploring the lower doses to see if we can just show a difference between the low dose and the moderate to higher dose. So the blue line are the control people, and the control people stayed, they had a little bit of an improvement over time. This is where we measure our outcomes in the middle of the graph. They had a little bit of improvement over time, but they stayed, approximately the same to a little bit better. Whereas the MDMA group in red went way down. And the measure here is a clinical interview to measure the severity of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. And this interview is given by a completely different clinician who's never seen the people while they're under the influence of anybody, of any MDMA or placebo. And then afterwards, they get the 0 milligram or 40 milligram people, they get the active dose. And then they also come back down and have the same results as the people who originally got the active dose. So that's an internally controlled design. And these are the effect sizes. So if you have an effect that's 0.8 or more, that's a really large effect, and it's going to give you significant results, even if it's a small sample. So overall, the studies, we're seeing that we're having a medium to large effect. So I say medium. This is the 2-session data, and this is the 3-session data. So from 2 sessions, it's almost at 0.8. So we actually have a couple data points that we're still expecting, and we might even get 0.8. So that's really good. So the lessons learned from phase 2 studies, it looks like we have established safety parameters that are useful and repeatable in 7 controlled clinical trials. And the efficacy has a large effect, medium to large, depending on the number of sessions, but we can get a large effect. And the cause of PTSD does not appear to influence the results. So that's why, like in Emanuel's movie, you were getting similar stories from the rape survivors and the veterans because the cause of the trauma does not appear to influence the outcomes, which is something that's really important. You want to be able to generalize the results for a treatment like this. And the low doses of 25 to 40 milligrams of MDMA kind of have an anti-placebo effect, so people stay the same. However, during the course of treatment, it's actually a bit harder for them because they get very activated and they experience their symptoms more. Like I was saying, the MDMA can do that. It can make the symptoms feel more prominent while you're under the influence, but they don't get the support of the 100 to 125, and also 75 milligrams has that kind of supportive effect. So we're going to be going to FDA for our end of phase 2 meeting this summer. And FDA has to give permission to expand clinical trials into larger numbers, and then in those larger numbers, you really get a good sense of what the safety profile of the drug is going to be. And there's also a lot of other studies we have to do in order to support that. And we're going to have to fork up $400,000 and get a kilogram of MDMA made according to good manufacturing practices, which are highly strenuous and very document heavy.
You're running out of the 1985?
No, we can't use it because it wasn't created with good manufacturing practices. So we're going to still have the 1985 supply in the wings, but we can't use it for phase 3. And our proposed design for phase 3 clinical trials is still in development, but this is kind of what we're thinking right now: 75 to 125 milligrams of MDMA or placebo, given in that 12 weeks of psychotherapy container. And the outcomes will be assessed by a pool of independent raters that will be shared across sites. And we're thinking about major cities for phase 3 sites. And I mentioned that MAPS' 30th anniversary is coming up next month. It's in Oakland, not far from here. And we have some really cool stickers with our Global Psychedelic Dinners logo. You can tell your friends about the data you heard here in a dinner party, and then they will listen. All right, and that's it. So go ahead.
If anyone has any pressing questions now,
Yeah.
please feel free to ask, but we're going to do a longer Q&A at the end.
Yeah, we're going to save the Q&A for the end.
Are there some other indications that people are kind of chopping it that we think MDMA is going to be great for, blah, 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 and you're just kind of waiting to see how it goes?
So depression is a big one. So we measure depression in all of our studies as a secondary outcome. But right now in our data, the depression results look really good and promising. However, people are most likely depressed because they have, underlying PTSD or because they have the social anxiety associated with autism. And so in order to parse that out, we would have to do a study specifically in people who are only depressed and don't have the other disorders. So that's probably the next big one. And there's a recent scientific review article that came out that was really proposing this. And I think that MAPS is poised to explore depression after we get approval for the other ones. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Awesome talk.
Thanks.
Thank you. Go Stanford. Do you, maybe I'll start it the way that you probably get a lot of annoying questions, which is, I heard that there has been some studies on MDMA for couples counseling and couples treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an area you guys are interested in?
Yeah, that is actually our study. So it hasn't started yet. And so we're still, we have clearance from FDA. It's actually Rebecca's study. Yeah, so you can talk to her more about it later. But it's specifically in the context of PTSD that we're interested in the couples therapy, because when one person it's not just significant others, it's like family members also that are severely impacted by PTSD, because it's becomes more of like a community problem because they push all of their friends and family away. Due to the symptoms of PTSD. But we can definitely get into more detail in the Q&A, and I'm going to leave it to Emanuel.
Thank you, Berra. And thank you, MAPS. So, I like to say I'm making a movie about MDMA, and, the working title is MDMA the Movie. But the secret really is that I'm making a drug policy reform documentary that pivots around MDMA. Because I believe MDMA has changed public perception around psychoactive drugs in ways that no other drug before has. And that we need to end the drug war for various reasons. I have a social justice background in racial justice and got involved in sort of drug policy reform through prison activist work, where I worked in Oakland with families, mostly African-American families, who had sons or fathers in prison, for life, for a handful of rocks. And then I started doing needle exchange and got to know and understood addiction more. And truthfully, we need to legalize and regulate the more dangerous drugs first. We could save so many lives if we, ended the drug war. But the truth is the public, this is going to happen incrementally, and the public is much more willing to legalize drugs that they perceive to have lower risk. And this is why we're seeing marijuana, the first drug legalized. And I want to explain why MDMA is going to be the second drug legalized. And not just for medical use, but for recreational or celebratory use. And I believe it's because, for a number of reasons. One, it's medicinal, like marijuana is, and has a very enthusiastic community of advocates. I would say second only to marijuana, but marijuana's advocates aren't even as enthusiastic as MDMA advocates are. Maybe they're longer term because they use it for the rest of their life, and MDMA is a short-lived, it's, people kind of phase out of it. But, people that take MDMA and are touched by it want to do it with their parents. I did it with my dad. It's really can have profound transformative experiences. And so that makes a great base for activism. Second or third reason is that next to marijuana, it's the most popular drug, not in terms of amount used, but in the percentage of people that use it. It doesn't dissolve the ego, it doesn't cause hallucinations that some people find scary. It's broken out of the psychonaut niche, right, into mainstream society, fraternity, sororities, etc. So that's the positive side of MDMA. But there's a negative side that I also believe is the reason it's going to be the second drug legalized, and that has to do with the adulterated market. There is no other drug as highly adulterated as the MDMA market. There are literally hundreds of drugs sold under the names ecstasy and Molly, and the greatest risk today remains actually getting something other than MDMA when you buy a pill. To the degree that adverse reactions are also related to dose, prohibition creates a market where you have no idea how much you're actually taking. And I've worked with family members who have lost children to MDMA who get instantly that the drug war, that prohibition was the main reason that their son or daughter died. And they're now starting to make alliances with the opiate mothers, I like to call them. And, there's been a lot of progress made with naloxone, and we're seeing maybe even we're going to have safe injection sites. And it's a great time to be involved in drug policy reform. Gay rights and drug policy reform are the two issues we're making progress on. Name something else. Can anyone name something else? The environment, the economy, war, maybe Bernie, right? If he wins. So, there's great thing. Also, MDMA is a great drug to bring conservatives and liberals together on because it is so effective in helping families. And conservatives, once they get that, can understand it. It is effective at treating PTSD in veterans, many of whom come from Midwest conservative families. So there's a lot of reasons, and I think we should be hopeful. 18 years ago, when I started DanceSafe, the media, the general environment was very hostile. Now things have changed. The young people who were utilizing DanceSafe services back then are now in positions of power. They're in the media, Plus, the corporate media is just sort of kind of disappearing with the internet. Millennials never go to CNN.com, right? So there's just the internet has made democratized communication in ways that the truth can really get out. And I'm really impressed with young people. I'm really inspired by young people because they've started really to come out and take the offensive. And I really want to say how much we have to do that. And by that, what I mean is we have to start being out and proud about our psychedelic use. speaking about the benefits that we've obtained from them, not being fearful, and criticizing the drug war for causing harms. You know, people of Rick's generation, you know, who came off the heels of the Nixon crackdown on psychedelics, and there are still people, please know, in prison today for marijuana from the 60s or LSD. There was a lot of fear back then, and the original strategy, and I commend it, it was right for that time, it was to go strictly medical and academic, right? It was like, and MAPS has been pushing MDMA legalization medically. But when that happens in 2021, it's not going to have an effect at all on the recreational market. I mean, I don't know how many therapists might be able to get licensed and how many patients they might be able to see in a year 1 to 3 times. It's going to be a great victory. It's going to help a lot of people, but there's still going to be a crackdown. People going to jail, Wesleyan students having their lives ruined. Now Santa Cruz also. The drug war for MDMA is still going to proceed after MDMA is legalized medically. It's going to be a good step in the right direction, but if we look at other drugs that are legal medically, like opiates, like cocaine, like meth that they prescribe to children, there's still this crackdown on there. So one thing I'm trying to do in my movie is expand the conversation, bring together the medical advocates with recreational users who know that they're fine. Despite that some people get in trouble with drugs, this is true for all drugs. The vast majority of drug use is non-problematic. Most people who use any given illicit drug do not become addicted, and it is not problematic. These are surveys. Have you used heroin in the last year? Yes. Well, how many of those people are addicts? 5 to 10%, that's it. Most people, even with heroin, we'll go out to the mission, we'll score some heroin, we'll have some fun. You know, most drug use is non-problematic. But there's this huge stigma around drug use, and you know, that stigma comes from, well, it comes from racism, if you learn the history of the drug war, and it comes from people not understanding what drugs do. And this is a big hurdle, something that I want to deal with in my movie. Most people haven't taken any illicit drug besides maybe marijuana once when they were younger. Most people. And this is something that you really should wrap your heads around, because this is what people think who haven't used drugs about illicit drugs. It doesn't matter what drug it is. If you want to understand your adversary so that you can meet them halfway and bring them along, you've got to understand what they think. And here it is. Drugs, whether they're talking about cocaine, LSD, heroin, MDMA, whatever, here's what people think that they do. They give you immense pleasure and thus can make you addicted. They cause you to do things that you regret, kind of, you know, go crazy and disinhibit you. That's it. They might think, okay, LSD makes you hallucinate and heroin's a downer and meth is an upper, but generally they have no idea. They have no idea what drugs do. So, you know, one reason marijuana is being legalized is because virtually everyone knows someone who's done it. And when you know someone who's done it and they're fine, then you know, maybe what I heard was wrong. So we need to speak out loudly and proudly about our psychedelic use so that people, so we can erase this stigma and the misperceptions that are going on. And I want to show a 3-minute clip that's actually going to be in the movie. It's a rough cut, so it might change a little bit, but this little clip I want to show you is from a couple that agreed to be in our film, who live in Canada, who take MDMA on their own 4 times a year for personal marriage counseling. They call it their 3-month audit. And this is a very, very common way that people use MDMA, and a lot of the general public doesn't know about this. Like, one of the things in my film I wanted to do is sort of show the gamut of how people use the drug. And one of the better ways of filmmaking is to show the unfolding stories as they happen of protagonists, sympathetic characters, rather than my first short film here, which was just it was all talking heads, people being interviewed, telling stuff that happened in the past. We actually found people who we followed around and who were willing to take MDMA on camera. And so I wanted to show the gamut. We have a story of 2 veterans. Then we also have a recreational user, festival goer, who did it on her birthday with her best friend for fun. And we filmed that incident. What's so great about it to me is that it's really anticlimactic, right? You see people on MDMA and like, well, they're pretty normal. They might say, oh, I love you too, but when you watch media representations of people on MDMA or any drug, it's like so ridiculous, right? It reflects what I just said about disinhibit you, make you go crazy, do things you regret, etc. Who saw Dope? Yeah, Dope's a great movie. It's about these kids who get caught up in a gang and they're sort of forced to sell a kilo of MDMA or they're going to die, right? So you can't judge them for being evil because they have to do it because the gang is going to kill them, right? So what do? They start a Silk Road account and they start packaging it in their high school. And it's a comedy. It's really, really funny. But it's the representation of people on MDMA in the movie is just ridiculous. This woman, she passes out, she wakes up, and she runs and takes her pants off and pees in front of a Starbucks. Who came up with that? Have they ever done MDMA? So I filmed people on MDMA. They signed, a 15-page release before I filmed them, right? And it's pretty anticlimactic, and that's going to be the big surprise, right? So we have the recreational user. In the middle, a clip I'm going to show you now, is this couple who I think are kind of blend. They're not strict medical, and they're not, recreational fun. They do it for personal therapy. And they're very open about it. They're very open with their kids. And this couple has a dinner conversation with their kids where they talk about drugs. Nothing like this has ever been put in film, and this is what's going to reduce stigma. Ready? The stigma not only drives the drug war, but this is what I've learned from decades of doing harm reduction work. Prohibition and stigma in drug war culture manifests the very misuse and abuse among young people that it claims it's trying to prevent. Young people need permission. They need a healthy, appropriate, modeled drug-taking behavior, particularly around, drugs that have benefits like psychedelics. But we can't because they're illegal. Parents fear that if they talk openly with their kids are going to tell their friends are going to tell their parents, and then they're going to get in trouble and all that. We are going to deal with these issues in the movie. Is this country ready for this yet? That's the question I have. Is my film going to be too early for some of this stuff? I don't know. I'm making it. And we'll see. But we got to start somewhere. And again, I'm really impressed with the younger generation. I've been on so many podcasts, like the young people, like Psychedelic Success Show, and there's Psychedelic Parenting Show, and just people putting out shows all the time on the internet. It's really changing the culture. We owe this to the tech world. You're a lot of you are tech people, right? Yeah. The internet has really, really changed things. I'm 46. It's incredible. The genie is out of the bag now. Information is out there, and propaganda has much less effect, especially on young people. They didn't grow up with talking heads, the friendly face that gives you the truth, And that's really, really impacting drugs. In fact, I think that drug education has been one of the more primary mushrooming of truth over the last 10, 15 years of any area, because you can't get truthful information about drugs anywhere else. Teachers won't tell you the truth because they're afraid of getting accused of promoting illicit drug use, et cetera, et cetera. So we have raised and spent about $150,000 for this film so far. We need about $300,000 more for our production. We have an investment vehicle. We already have 3 Silicon Valley investors who've come on board. You need to be a qualified investor. If you know anybody who's a qualified investor, and that means roughly $1 million in assets other than your home, or $200,000 a year or more, and they want to become a part of our LLC, join Viveka Films and be a part of something that's going to be transformative, change the world, and make a profit in the end, because I really do believe the film's going to be profitable. We're going for a mainstream audience. We're dealing with universal themes. Trauma and healing, obviously. Veterans, the world knows now there's an epidemic. That's only been in the last 5 years, PTSD epidemic. Most people didn't know 5 years ago, but now they do. I like to say I'm not making a film, a niche film for a psychedelic market. I want to make a movie that bridges the gap. In fact, I feel the best way to honor MDMA is not to make a movie all about MDMA that's filled with geek knowledge and all, but to make a movie that causes people to leave the theater with a little more empathy for the other side. We need to bring conservatives who have misunderstandings about psychedelics to our side, and the way you do that is to be really respectful. We're going to film in at least 4 or 5 other countries. MDMA has an international appeal because human brains are the same everywhere. And there's a lot of great stuff happening in Australia now. My gosh, they're out protesting against sniffer dogs, and mothers who are starting petitions in Australia for pill testing at raves. It's like really amazing what's happening. And so we have a very confident the film. I just got an email yesterday from a German distributor saying, I want to distribute your film in Germany, right? So this is my little pitch, we need to raise more money, and you can make a donation, and MAPS has agreed to pass through nonprofit donations through to us, or you can invest in the film and become a part of the team. And let people who have deeper pockets know about this, and we'll be very, very appreciative, and we'll change the world together. How much time do we have? Should we just open it up to questions?
Yep.
Great. Here.
Yeah, I had a question.
Do you want to come up, Berra?
Sure.
Yeah.
This is going to be about PTSD, right? Because you always hear about PTSD in terms of like the most extreme situations, right? Like, which I hope not to like put a spotlight on anyone. I hope a lot of people in this room, have this, right? But you can still have some like form, have felt some form of PTSD, right? So what is the easiest definition, like dumbed down definition of PTSD, for like potentially non-rape and coming back from war veteran?
That is an excellent question. And this is how I believe that MDMA actually holds promise, not just for healing these very strict, severe cases of, post-traumatic stress disorder, but to heal culture and people in general, and why there's so many advocates for MDMA. What you're talking about is the difference between PTS and PTSD. PTSD is simply when your post-traumatic stress reaches a certain level that it becomes really debilitating. But everybody suffers from post-traumatic stress. If you get in a car accident, it might be hard for you to ride in a car. You see things out of the corner of your eye and it scares you. If you were bullied once as a child, that could have a lasting effect on your social ability. If your parents say, one thing wrong to you, even if they're otherwise great parents, that, psychologists know this, like that can have an effect on you. And MDMA, if we're seeing 83% of these severe treatment-resistant cases of PTSD heal from MDMA, what do you think it's doing for people who just have mild PTS? It's really, really helping people.
And they say everybody has experienced trauma. It's just how your body and your brain reacts to that trauma, which is what is the disorder, right?
Yeah.
And actually, like, that's actually the same thing about addiction potential. You know, everybody has used these substances. It's just that in a very small percentage of people, their brains have developed in a way from their childhood, so that they keep needing the external stimulus to go back and experience that feeling. What we're seeing in our studies is that, you know, people are exposed to MDMA 2-3 times, maybe more if they have like a low dose and then cross over to the full dose. But they're not seeking it out as an external stimulus for that feeling after the studies. And that's really what, you know, the regulators were concerned about, is that, like, you know, they're gonna think this is amazing because they saw it and felt it in the clinical trial, and then they're gonna keep wanting it. But it's because their brains are essentially getting healed, rewired through neuroplasticity, which is getting activated by MDMA and helping to rewire the brain.
Yeah, the man, I didn't show that one. I just recently released on MDMAthemovie.com. You can go to our pre-release videos down at the bottom. The most recent release is a man with Asperger's who took it twice, and he told me he doesn't think he's ever going to use it again, but he talks about his transformation on it. That said, there are many people that do become compulsive in their use, but I would say one of the only drugs I can rightfully say is like non-addictive is MDMA, and that's really because of how it works pharmacologically. You can't just take it back to back. You got to put time between your use or it just won't work.
Yeah, the serotonin shuts off because MDMA shuts it off, you know, the production of serotonin.
Right, right. And then there's a strange long-term tolerance effect where you really only get so many really great MDMA experiences, and the magic kind of goes away over time. So it kind of has a built-in anti-addiction quality to it.
Self-limiting is what we like to call it.
Yeah.
I have a question about the demographics of some of the research that MAPS has done, and I'm specifically curious about like race and gender breakdown of who's participated in the studies, thinking of just like histories of violence and trauma in the U.S. and in the world, and where like we see more PTSD in communities of color, and how is sort of like MAPS taking a social justice approach to?
Yeah, we definitely want to take that social justice approach. Unfortunately, up until now, these have been kind of like demonstration projects in really limited numbers of people, and they're primarily in white Caucasians. We have varied the locations of the studies. So we have a study in Israel. The data was combined with all the other studies in what I showed you. We had a study in Canada and a study in Switzerland. Now Israel is a place where like pretty much everybody has PTSD because they're born into it. It's endemic. And so in that population, we still get good results. Unfortunately, with the people of color question, there's actually financial barriers that prevent people from being able to, not work for the duration of the treatment and, be able to juggle being in a clinical trial with this 12 weeks of psychotherapy. I mean, most people who are in a lower income range have to work for a living. They have to work 2-3 jobs to make a living. And being able to take that time away from not feeding your family is not an option for them. And I think that's really like the disincentive that we really need to be aware of and meeting halfway when we go into larger numbers. Now we are looking at hopefully incorporating sites in locations where there is a lot of racial trauma, and we're also actively talking to therapists who focus on racial trauma, so that we can see if they're either they could be a phase 3 therapist or they could get trained. What we're going to try and do after the phase 3 clinical trials start is hopefully ask FDA for permission if they'll let us start kind of a compassionate use program like marijuana did have for many years, but it was only in a limited number of people. But they were getting their marijuana from the government, from NIDA actually. So with MDMA, what we're going to try and do is supplement our coverage with the phase 3 clinical trial sites, and then also have additional people that are licensed, and we're collecting some safety data on through this expanded access or compassionate use program. And I think that's really where we'll be able to reach more people that won't have this disincentive.
You had a question?
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like the phase 2 study showed overwhelming positive efficacy for the trial, and I was wondering, what are you guys most worried about for phase 3? Is there anything that you think might come up that would stop it passing the FDA? Because it seems everything is pretty much positive.
Trump.
Trump can single-handedly do bad things. But yeah, our main concerns with switching to phase 3, and this is something that Amy and I talk about every day. So basically, there's a lot of strategy needed because, for one thing, these are small numbers, and as a result, the variability in the small numbers is also small. Not as small as one would think, but it's still, relatively small. So we need to really have a good sense of what is the true level of variability in the population. That's one thing. And then the other is, there's several, but the next one is, I'm not sure if people have a background in any therapy knowledge or anything, but they changed the manual for how you diagnose disorders just recently. So this manual is based on a bunch of statistical constructs, and lots of therapists get into committees and talk about this construct and that construct, and then they decided that they're going to change the criteria for PTSD.
Uh-oh.
And then how you diagnose and measure the results will also change. And the results of those studies of how you measure the change are still not published, although we are talking to the authors, luckily. So that means that our assessment is going to be different.
I'm not worried.
I'm not worried either, but it's still variability that's hard to predict. And the goal of doing the phase 2 studies was to figure out what is your difference between your control group and your active group. And based on that difference, you can figure out, well, how many people do we need for phase 3? And for phase 3, it looks like we're probably going to need about 460 people or so is what we're estimating across 2 confirmatory studies, meaning 2 studies designed similarly and they have the same results. The issue is that we don't know how those results are going to be measured. Will the measurements compare? And then also there's subgroups within people that have PTSD. PTSD is a really heterogeneous thing. People with PTSD are more likely to have chronic pain. They're more likely to talk about their chronic pain. They're more likely to have things like tinnitus and physiological things that really bothers them. They're about, depending on the study, between 70 to 85 or 90%, depending on the study, of people with PTSD also have depression. And so it's always been a big question in the field, is it chicken or the egg? Which one comes first? And so then the regulations and guidances that government agencies have created also reflect that confusion sometimes. So they're oh, you only have to study PTSD, you can't also study depression. So the comorbidity issue is big because not only are we having to re-educate the entire world, we also have to re-educate the governments and the people that work in those governments and that don't have a science background, and we need to say things in a way that's going to make sense to those people.
Here's why I'm not worried. Raise your hand if MDMA was valuable in your life. Raise your hand if MDMA was transformative in your life. Almost everyone still kept their hand up. Yeah, I mean, MAPS is basically convincing the government of what we knew 40 years ago, what Sasha figured out, what Leo Zeff figured out, and why MDMA spread around the world as a therapeutic agent. Yeah.
A lot of people would say the field of psychology is also studying and showing what you already know to be true.
Yeah.
Another big unknown is that this was done by just a few very well-trained therapists that we know very well, and now it's going to go out into a much larger group of therapists that we are currently training. And so, the results, so there's many ways that are introducing variability in the phase 3, and that's the case for any drug development. You're going to a broader population, more people doing the treatment. Not everybody goes through having their measure changed, their primary endpoint measure changed between phase 2 and phase 3. But I have to echo, I'm not worried either.
Yeah.
I have a question that's a little bit broader than just MDMA, but so first of all, thank you so much everybody for being here. This is awesome, and I feel like this is a particularly interesting opportunity because we have people who are coming from a psychotherapy background and talking about what I consider mental health issues, and then people talking about stopping the war on drugs, and naturally having to answer questions about, well, what about addiction? What about the negative uses of drugs? And so my question is this. In my own personal life, I've noticed how different the dynamic is when you are using substances for, I like your term of using it for a celebratory purpose, versus when you're emotionally compromised and you're really using it as an escape. And it's two very, very different relationships you have with alcohol and drugs. And so as much as I like the pitch of the war on drugs is incredibly damaging to us as a society, how do we approach this as when people are in an emotionally compromised state and they do have access to substances, there's a, and I'm purely speaking from personal experience here, but in my experience, that's an easy path towards destructive behavior that's difficult to reverse yourself from. And this is kind of cool because we have mental health professionals in the room and we have people advocating for stopping prohibition. How do we do this? How do we not end up with stopping prohibition and overflowing the mental health world?
I am so glad you asked that question because that is the most important question to ask. That is the question I'm going to address in my movie. The first thing I would respond to that is that prohibition has not stopped the spread of these drugs, period. And in fact, legalization can reduce access to drugs, particularly among minors. And I like to give these two examples when I explain this to people, marijuana and heroin, because we have examples where both those drugs have been legalized. And I'll tell you exactly how. Marijuana, we all know, we're in Colorado. I mean, we're here in California, and it's de facto legal recreationally, but Colorado and Washington and other states have legalized it recreationally, and nobody is concerned about increased access to marijuana, even to kids, really, because, right, safer than alcohol, nobody's died from it. Every state that has passed these laws is allowing backyard cultivation, and the whole point is to create a taxable retail market. Voters are not concerned with marijuana's access increasing. And on the other side, we have heroin, where heroin maintenance programs in Switzerland and Germany and some other countries are a form of legalized heroin where, that's what I was going to say. I forgot the punchline here. So marijuana legalization is liberalization, but legalization is not always liberalization. In fact, legal regulation, that's the better term to use, can often be more conservative than prohibition. And the perfect model for this is heroin maintenance programs. The Swiss were the first to do it like 14 years ago. What they said to themselves correctly, what researchers, public health professionals said is, oh my God, this is such an epidemic. How are we going to stop this? They realized, well, most heroin users take up dealing in order to fund their habit, creating more heroin addicts. Why don't we take all the heroin addicts off the market, give them heroin from their doctors that would remove from the market the majority of heroin sales, because even though addicts, again, are a small percentage of users, they comprise the vast majority of sales because they use large doses every day. You take the heroin users out of the illicit criminal market and you allow them to get clean, pure heroin administered to them from a doctor 3 times a day, as much as they want. All you got to do is give up your driver's license and you got to stay for half an hour where they have naloxone to make sure you don't overdose. And indeed, what they saw is a dramatic reduction in the number of new addicts because the profit potential on the heroin market just dried up. They also saw a remarkable result, which is that 60% of the people that entered this program, after 2 years, quit heroin for good. They didn't expect that. That's very interesting, though, to me. You remove the pretense of treatment, and you just let them have their heroin, and they decide after 2 years, why am I doing this? It's the stigma and the fact you have to associate with criminals, you have to spend all your money on the drug, you can now, under the program, put food in the fridge for your kids, you can get a job, you can get your life back on track again. Has a greater success rate than any treatment program we know of. The removal of treatment entirely. But anyway, back to legal regulation of heroin. Very, very strict. The opposite of marijuana. Just remove the addicts. You have to prove you're an addict. You remove them from the market. You dry up the heroin market. If for a drug like MDMA, it would be somewhere in the middle. But if we legalized and regulated MDMA so that adults could have safe legal access to a certain amount per month from dispensaries under a national registry, so that they couldn't get, where nobody wants just like libertarian, let anyone produce as much MDMA as they want, right? Because there's enough pleasure involved, especially when you take children, there's enough pleasure involved that young people could get into trouble like they're doing right now, But if you remove all the adults from the MDMA market, right? Because if you could get MDMA legally, pure MDMA, you knew how much it was, like who in the right mind would go to a stranger and buy a mystery powder? No one would do it. You would shrink the MDMA market, not just all the adulterants on it, but you would shrink it enough that you would reduce access to minors. And that's very important if we're going to appeal to parents and conservatives addressing the question that you have right there. Legalization of MDMA is not liberalization. It's actually more conservative. We can protect the civil rights of adults as well as protect the weak and the vulnerable and children. Now, we will have people always ask, how much are you going to give adults per month, say, under this program? And my answer is as much as it takes to reduce the criminal market by 80%. Right? You're going to have diversion. You're going to have, just like with alcohol, adults buying it and giving it to minors, and it'll remain illegal, but that's an immensely more preferable situation than what we have today, where my stepdaughter says she can buy Molly from a number of her friends, but at least she has to go to an adult to buy alcohol. So that's number one. We're talking about a more conservative approach, because prohibition is not drug control, it's the abdication of drug control, turning over manufacture and distribution to criminals who don't ask for ID. I'll let a mental health professional talk about how you treat addiction. I know, though, for sure, addiction is exacerbated by the drug war when you put people in jail, when you stigmatize them. We need to deal with those issues from a public health perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, that was actually an awesome clarification that I actually haven't heard before said so eloquently, so that's awesome. I think what's ironic for me is that, just a small anecdote, I kind of had the pleasure of using MDMA with a fairly conservative girlfriend, and afterwards she looked at me and she said, "How come alcohol is legal?" And this is I'm trying to find somebody, because there's a very, very common statement. What your girlfriend or your friend said is very common. I mean, I haven't filmed, but I've been around a lot of people who have been taking it for the first time, and I said this for the first time, and I've heard other people say it too. Like, why the hell is this illegal? Because MDMA is the only drug that we know of, aside from SSRIs in some cases, but again, they also work on serotonin. The only psychoactive drug that we know of where people who are on it say they feel more themselves. And Matthew Baggett, researcher, did actual studies where you administer what's called the authenticity index. It's a survey. And compared to placebos, the survey asks questions like, do you have to pretend? How do you feel like you're being honest, things like that. People on MDMA feel more themselves. What drug do we know that does that? And so, it doesn't. It's exactly the opposite of what people think, disinhibits you, makes you do things you regret. No, I don't know very many people at all who've said that, that they've done things that they regret on MDMA.
it tends to bring the best out in people, unlike other drugs, and makes people wonder why. I mean, but we know why. It's illegal because of the drug war. It's illegal. You don't want to know this is. I'm going to bring this out in my film, and I'm actually dedicating my film to Richard Rockefeller. You know who Richard Rockefeller is. I saw him speak at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco a few years ago. We had a couple conversations afterwards. He tragically died in a plane crash. He was on a board of Doctors Without Borders. Great, great man. Really demonstrates you can have money and still be a highly ethical person that changes the world, right? He said, he described the history of prohibition of LSD in the 60s in a way I'd never heard it before. And what he said was that post-World War II, there was never a time where we had as many people with PTSD in this country. Maybe after the Civil War, greater percentage, but we don't have enough, so far away we don't know. But there were so many people with PTSD coming back from the war. They called it shell shock at the time. And how did we deal with it as a culture? Well, it's kind of a joke now when we look back at 50s culture. Now is the time, now is the best time, right? We repressed it. Father knows best, and it was kind of surreal when you look at shows from the 50s or commercials or stuff like that, right? And so then what happened in the 60s? You had the children who grew up in these families where they saw the disconnect between what their culture was telling them and the reality of their home lives, with suicides and domestic violence and alcoholism. And now suddenly LSD appears on the scene, right? Like MDMA, a psychedelic that can snap you out of habitual ways of thinking. And at that very same time, the US launches another war and a draft and tells these young people, now we're going to do to you what we did to your parents. And everything's going to be great, right? No. So you had Timothy Leary, who many people say kind of set the movement back with his tune in, turn on, drop out. You had the 60s culture saying a big fuck you to the government. And LSD became associated with an anti-establishment movement, the anti-war movement, et cetera. But really, it was just about our inability as a culture to deal effectively with PTSD. And the irony is that it took another war, the war on terror, and another epidemic of PTSD for us, and MAPS, for us to finally start dealing with PTSD correctly. And you could talk more about this, but the VA and the Department of Defense is now they're actually getting involved in the phase 3 studies. So there's a lot of hope, that we're going to see psychedelics legalized in my lifetime.
So yeah, I can speak a little bit about what is going on with the VA a little bit more. I know that's been a special area of interest for Joe too. So we have proposed multiple demonstration projects to the VA and the Department of Defense over the years, and they haven't succeeded within the context of those organizations or departments and organizations. However, the people that work there are super interested because they see nothing's working to their satisfaction, and they're having to treat people with off-label medications. I mean, the crazy thing is that most of these vets, they come back from the war and the first thing they get is an antipsychotic medication, Seroquel. Seroquel is now the 5th most prescribed drug in the United States, and it's because of PTSD, and it's completely off-label. There is no evidence that Seroquel helps PTSD. Nothing. In fact, what it's doing is exacerbating metabolic problems and overweightness and diabetes, and these are known side effects of Seroquel, published on the package insert. You can look it up. So, really, they don't have a lot of options, and also there's 2 medications that are approved for PTSD. They're both antidepressants. They were initially approved for depression treatment, and then there were 2 confirmatory studies to expand the indication to PTSD. Now, the same antidepressants are also approved for treating social anxiety. It's not quite a surprise that we're also trying to treat these things. And it's because they're working similarly, but they're not rapid action. And so the clinical trials for these antidepressants were 12 weeks long. You had to take a drug every day. With a drug with daily dosing, the adverse effects compound on each other as the drug accumulates in your system. And in order to be effective, the drug also has to be at steady state in your blood, meaning there has to be a steady amount constantly in your system in order for them to work. Now, that's not necessarily an effective way of treating something that is chronic, has a high rate of relapse, is associated with suicidal ideation and behavior, and so that's why it's such a big issue for the VA and for the Department of Defense. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any phase 3 sites that are directly affiliated with the VA. There's strategic reasons for that also, and we have had interest from VA people that want to try and convince their VA center that this is a good idea. And there's been a lot of meetings, and one thing that we actually benefit greatly from is the National Center for PTSD is super open with all of their resources. They share their training resources with us. They try to get letters of support for MDMA studies. It's really cool. They just can't support us monetarily, and they can't support us within the VA. The VA is also kind of opening things up with marijuana right now. Because a lot of the veterans have anecdotally reported that marijuana is helping them to manage their symptoms for PTSD. And we have a separate study that's of marijuana for PTSD that we got a grant to do, and it's a separate parallel thing. But we're also learning more about PTSD through that.
Any other questions? Joe?
I actually have a problem. We ordered a ton of food. You're going to have to eat even if you're not hungry. We got beer and soft drinks and some hot apple cider. So I would kind of like to wrap it up.
Yeah.
So people could have smaller conversations while all the rest of you are helping us out by helping us with this food. Is that okay with everybody?
Everybody eat.
Thank you, everyone. Joe, thank you. Thank you very much.